Welcome to Marple Mysteries, where every clue matters, and every secret has a story. Join us on a journey through Agatha Christie's most intriguing mysteries, narrated with immersive storytelling. Stay sharp, listen closely, and let's solve the case together. The mystery begins now.
Chapter 1. An Unexpected Discovery. The village of St. Mary Mead had enjoyed an unusually pleasant spring. Gardens bloomed with an enthusiasm that suggested nature was making up for the previous year's dismal showing, and even the most curmudgeonly of residents found themselves remarking on the fine weather with something approaching good humor. Miss Jane Marple had spent the better part of the morning tending to her prize-winning dahlias. Despite her advancing years, she maintained her garden with meticulous care, her thin fingers surprisingly nimble as they worked among the stems and leaves. She had just straightened up, one hand pressed against the small of her back, when she heard the garden gate click open. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called Dolly Bantry, her old friend and neighbor. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, dear," Miss Marple replied, removing her gardening gloves. "I was just thinking of taking a break. Would you care for some tea?" Mrs. Bantry nodded enthusiastically. "That would be lovely. I've just come from the post office, and I simply must tell you about what's happened at Gossington Hall." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes lit up with interest. Gossington Hall, once owned by the Bantrys themselves, had been sold several years ago to Marina Gregg, the famous film actress. After Marina's tragic death, the property had changed hands again, this time to a reclusive writer named Edmund Carstairs, who had moved to St. Mary Mead 6 months ago. "Something to do with Mr. Carstairs, I presume?" Miss Marple asked as she led the way into her cottage. The interior was exactly what one would expect of an elderly spinster of modest means, but impeccable taste. Comfortable rather than fashionable, with chintz-covered furniture that had seen decades of use, but remained well-maintained. Several photographs in silver frames adorned the mantelpiece, silent witnesses to a long life filled with more adventure than most would suspect. "Indeed," Mrs. Bantry confirmed, settling into her usual armchair while Miss Marple busied herself with the tea things. "He's causing quite a stir. It seems he's found a collection of old letters hidden behind a panel in the library, letters that apparently belonged to Sir Randolph Petrie." Miss Marple paused in the act of setting out cups. "Sir Randolph Petrie, the historian who lived at Gossington before you and Colonel Bantry purchased it?" "The very same. You remember how he died under such peculiar circumstances back in '28? "I do recall something of the sort," Miss Marple said carefully. "Wasn't there some question about his research? Something about medieval manuscripts?" "Precisely." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "Sir Randolph claimed to have discovered evidence of a previously unknown royal diary from the time of Henry VII, something that would rewrite history, he said. But after his death no such manuscript was ever found, and most people assumed it was merely the pompous boasting of an old academic." Miss Marple poured the tea with a steady hand. "And these letters Mr. Carstairs has found, they relate to this manuscript?" "They might. According to Gladys at the post office, who heard it from Mrs. Carstairs' new housekeeper, the letters mention a discovery of tremendous significance and contained references to someone Sir Randolph feared was trying to steal his work." Mrs. Bantry accepted her cup with a nod of thanks. "But that's not the most interesting part." "Oh?" Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. "No. The interesting part is that Mr. Carstairs announced his find at the Historical Society meeting last night, quite dramatically, I'm told, and this morning, when he went to show the letters to Professor Wilkins from Oxford, who'd come specially to see them, they were gone, stolen from his study sometime during the night." "How very curious," Miss Marple murmured. "Was anything else taken?" "That's just it. Nothing. Not even the silver paperweight that was apparently sitting right beside the letters. Just the letters themselves. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. And who knew about these letters, besides those at the Historical Society meeting? Well, that's half the village by now, Mrs. Bantry admitted. You know how word spreads. But at the actual meeting there were about 20 people. The vicar was there, of course, and Dr. Haydock, and the Ellises from the manor house. Oh, and that new young man staying at the Blue Boar. Gregory something or other. An academic type himself, I believe? I see, said Miss Marple. She took a sip of her tea, her expression thoughtful. And Mr. Carstairs, how did he react to the theft? Called the police immediately. Inspector Craddock is handling the case. Mrs. Bantry's eyes twinkled. He asked after you, by the way. Said he hopes your rheumatism isn't troubling you too much this spring. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. Inspector Craddock had, on more than one occasion, found her insights unexpected, lie valuable. How kind of him. My rheumatism is quite manageable at present, thank you. Well, the whole thing has caused quite a sensation, Mrs. Bantry continued, especially given what happened at the meeting itself. Oh? Was there something unusual? Mrs. Bantry nodded emphatically. There was a dreadful argument between Mr. Carstairs and Professor Wilkins. Apparently they're academic rivals of some sort. Professor Wilkins all but accused Carstairs of fabricating the letters for publicity for his upcoming book. Called him a sensationalist hack right there in front of everyone, and then Miss Hardwick, you know, the librarian, she got involved as well. Seemed to take particular offense at something Carstairs said about the proper handling of historical documents. How very unpleasant, Miss Marple commented. And now the letters have vanished. Exactly. Mrs. Bantry set down her cup with a triumphant gesture. The question is, who took them? And why? Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully out of the window. I suppose, she said slowly, that would depend on whether the letters were genuine, and what secrets they might have contained. Little did she know that the disappearance of Sir Randolph Petrie's letters was merely the beginning of a mystery that would soon lead to a far more serious crime, one that would shake the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead to its foundations. Chapter 2. The village reacts by noon. The following day, the theft of the mysterious letters had become the sole topic of conversation in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, seated in her usual corner of the vicarage drawing-room at the weekly meeting of the Ladies' Aid Society, found herself perfectly positioned to observe the ripples of gossip spreading through the assembled women. Well, I always thought there was something not quite right about Mr. Carstairs, declared Mrs. Price Ridley, adjusting her hearing aid with a self-important air. Too secretive by half, hardly ever seen at church, and when he does attend, he slips away before anyone can engage him in proper conversation. Perhaps he simply values his privacy, suggested Miss Weatherby mildly. Creative types often do, I understand. Privacy is one thing. Suspicion is quite another, Mrs. Price Ridley countered. My nephew works for the publisher handling Mr. Carstairs' new book. He says the man's desperate for attention. Sales of his last novel were abysmal. This business with the letters might be nothing more than a publicity stunt. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, looked troubled. Surely you're not suggesting he invented the theft himself. That would be terribly dishonest. I'm merely saying what others are thinking, Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. And why were these supposedly valuable documents not kept in a safe? Very careless, or perhaps convenient. Miss Marple's nimble fingers continued their work on a small pink baby's jacket as she listened. Her expression remained placid, revealing nothing of her thoughts. "What do you make of it all, Miss Marple?" asked Mrs. Clement kindly, drawing her into the conversation. "You have such a gift for understanding these perplexing situations." Miss Marple gave a little deprecating laugh. "Oh, I wouldn't say that, dear, but it does remind me a little of something that happened with my nephew. Raymond's manuscript. Not that it was stolen, but there was a dreadful confusion when his publisher mixed up two similar works. It led to the most extraordinary misunderstandings." The others nodded politely, but without much interest in what they assumed to be one. of Miss Marple's rambling reminiscences. The conversation soon shifted to speculations about Professor Wilkins, who had taken a room at the Blue Boar Inn and showed no signs of leaving, despite the disappearance of the very items he had come to examine. I saw him having lunch with that young man. What's his name? Gregory Peters, contributed Miss Hartnell. Very intense conversation, it seemed. Hardly touched their food. As the meeting dispersed, Miss Marple made her way to the village shop, ostensibly to purchase some wool for her knitting. The bell above the door tinkled softly as she entered. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," greeted Mrs. Jameson from behind the counter. "Terrible business about those letters, isn't it?" "Most distressing," Miss Marple agreed. "I understand Inspector Craddock is investigating?" "Indeed he is. Been interviewing everyone who was at that Historical Society meeting one by one. He was in here earlier asking if I'd noticed anything unusual yesterday." "And had you?" Miss Marple inquired gently, examining a skein of pale blue wool. Mrs. Jameson lowered her voice conspiratorially. "As a matter of fact, I had. That librarian, Miss Hardwick, came in very late just before closing, seemed terribly agitated, buying aspirin and asking if I'd seen anyone heading toward Gossington Hall. Most unusual for her, ordinarily so composed, you know." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Miss Hardwick has always been very dedicated to the preservation of historical artifacts. I imagine she would be particularly upset by any potential damage to significant documents." As she left the shop, wool secured in her basket, Miss Marple found herself face to face with Dr. Haydock, who was just stepping out of his car. "Ah, Miss Marple, how are you keeping? That shoulder giving you any trouble?" "Much better, thank you, Doctor," she replied with a smile. "This pleasant weather is most beneficial. I understand you were at the Historical Society meeting the other night?" "I was indeed," Dr. Haydock confirmed, falling into step beside her. "Quite the dramatic evening, even before the letters went missing. Carstairs and Wilkins have some sort of academic vendetta going back years, it seems. Something about discredited research and stolen ideas." "How very unfortunate," murmured Miss Marple. "And the letters themselves. Did you happen to see them?" "Only from a distance, I'm afraid. Carstairs was protective of them, wouldn't let anyone handle them directly. Kept them in a folder with some sort of plastic covering. Very professional about it, which makes the subsequent theft all the more peculiar." They paused at the corner where their paths would diverge. "By the way," Dr. Haydock added, "I'm attending to Gregory Peters this afternoon, the young academic staying at the Blue Boar. Nothing serious, just a migraine, but he seems strangely reluctant to have medical attention. Perhaps worried about the cost, being a foreigner." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. "Mr. Peters is not British, then?" "American, I believe. Studying medieval history at some university over there. Came specifically to meet Carstairs, from what I gather. Well, good day to you, Miss Marple." As Dr. Haydock strode off, Miss Marple continued her walk home, her mind sifting through the various pieces of information she had gathered. The village reaction was following familiar patterns: suspicion, speculation, the inevitable searching for scandal. But beneath the surface gossip, certain details stood out to her practiced eye. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple was deadheading roses in her front garden when a police car pulled up outside her gate. Inspector Craddock emerged, his lean face breaking into a smile as he approached. "Miss Marple, I thought I might find you enjoying this fine weather." "Inspector Craddock, how lovely to see you," she greeted him warmly. "Would you care for some tea? I was about to take a break." "Thank you, but I'm afraid this isn't entirely a social call," he replied, his expression growing serious. "There's been a development in the case of the stolen letters. Mr. Carstairs received a ransom demand this morning." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed? How very interesting. Yes, but that's not why I'm here." Inspector Craddock hesitated, then continued gravely. "You see, Miss Hardwick, the librarian has gone missing, and her cottage shows signs of a struggle." Miss Marple's secateurs paused mid-snip. She looked up at the inspector, her pale blue eyes suddenly sharp as steel. "Oh, dear," she said softly. I was afraid something like this might happen. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. "You were expecting something like this to happen?" Inspector Craddock asked, his interest immediately piqued by Miss Marple's comment. Miss Marple set down her secateurs carefully on the garden table. "Not specifically. Miss Hardwick's disappearance? No," she clarified. "But whenever valuable items go missing, there is always the potential for escalation." The inspector nodded grimly. "May I ask what made you single out Miss Hardwick as a potential victim?" "I didn't precisely," Miss Marple replied, "but she did seem particularly agitated about the letters, from what I have heard. When documents of historical significance are involved, those who truly understand their value are often the most concerned." Craddock looked at her thoughtfully. "Would you mind if we continue this conversation inside? There are some details I'd like to share with you, unofficially, of course." Once settled in Miss Marple's parlor, the inspector explained the situation in greater detail. "The ransom note was found pinned to Carstairs' front door early this morning. Typed, ordinary paper, nothing distinctive. It demands £5,000 for the return of the letters. A relatively modest sum for documents of such purported historical significance," Miss Marple observed. "Precisely my thought," Craddock agreed. "As for Miss Hardwick's cottage, her neighbor reported hearing a commotion last night around 10 o'clock. When Miss Hardwick failed to open the library this morning and didn't answer her telephone, the neighbor alerted us. We found a broken vase, an overturned chair, signs of a struggle, but no blood or other indications of serious harm." "And no sign of Miss Hardwick herself?" "None. Her car is still in the garage, but her handbag and coat are missing." Miss Marple's fingers twisted thoughtfully in her lap. "Has Mr. Carstairs mentioned any particular relationship with Miss Hardwick, beyond their mutual interest in historical artifacts?" "He claims they were merely professional acquaintances," Craddock said. "Though his housekeeper suggests they may have had tea together on several occasions, Miss Hardwick apparently assisted him with research for his latest book." "I see," murmured Miss Marple. "And what of this young American scholar, Mr. Peters?" "Dr. Haydock mentioned him to me earlier." Craddock looked surprised. "Peters? He hasn't featured prominently in our inquiries thus far. Arrived in the village only 3 days ago, claims to be researching medieval history. He attended the Historical Society meeting, but sat at the back and didn't participate in the discussion. Why do you ask?" "Merely gathering the complete picture," Miss Marple said mildly. "In a village this size, newcomers are always of interest." After Inspector Craddock departed, Miss Marple sat for a long while, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she contemplated the facts before her. Eventually she reached for her telephone and dialed a familiar number. "Dolly? Yes, it's Jane. I wonder if you might accompany me on a little expedition tomorrow morning. I feel I should pay my respects to Mr. Carstairs. Given these troubling events, it would seem less intrusive with company, don't you think?" The following morning dawned bright and clear. Mrs. Bantry collected Miss Marple in her car, and they drove the short distance to Gossington Hall. The imposing Georgian house stood serene amidst its well-tended grounds, giving no hint of the drama unfolding within. "I still can't quite believe Miss Hardwick is missing," Mrs. Bantry said, as they approached the entrance. "Such a sensible woman, not the type to become involved in anything sordid." "People often surprise us," Miss Marple replied softly, "particularly when matters of the heart are involved." Mrs. Bantry glanced at her sharply. "The heart? Surely you don't think—" Their conversation was interrupted by the front door opening to reveal a tall, thin man in his early 50s with a high forehead and penetrating dark eyes. Edmund Carstairs regarded them with evident impatience. "Mrs. Bantry, isn't it? I'm afraid this isn't a convenient time for social calls." Mrs. Bantry drew herself up indignantly. "This is hardly a social call, Mr. Carstairs. My friend Miss Marple and I are deeply concerned about Miss Hardwick's disappearance. We thought perhaps we might be of some assistance." Carstairs's expression softened slightly. "I apologize for my curtness. Please come in. I'm somewhat overwrought, as you might imagine." He led them into a spacious drawing room where a younger man was pacing restlessly. He stopped abruptly as they entered. "Professor Wilkins, allow me to introduce Mrs. Bantry and Miss Marple from the village," Carstairs said with stiff formality. "Ladies, Professor Wilkins from Oxford University." Professor Wilkins gave a curt nod. He was perhaps 40, with thinning, fair hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that failed to soften his intense gaze. "I've agreed to postpone my return to Oxford until this matter is resolved," he explained, his tone suggesting this was a significant concession. "Most commendable," murmured Miss Marple. "You must be anxious about the letters, given their historical importance." "If they're genuine," Wilkins replied pointedly, "which remains to be established." Carstairs' jaw tightened visibly. "We've had this discussion, Wilkins. The provenance—" "Gentlemen," interrupted a smooth voice from the doorway, "perhaps we might focus on finding Miss Hardwick, rather than debating academic minutiae." The newcomer was a handsome man in his early 30s with an American accent and an air of casual confidence. He nodded to the ladies. "Gregory Peters, visiting scholar from Columbia University. My apologies for the atmosphere. Tensions are understandably high." Miss Marple studied him with gentle curiosity. "You're quite right, Mr. Peters. Miss Hardwick's welfare must be our primary concern. Did you know her well?" "We met at the Historical Society meeting," Peters replied. "She was extremely knowledgeable about medieval manuscripts, a shared interest. We had arranged to discuss Sir Randolph's work further, but—" He spread his hands expressively. "Have the police made any progress, Mr. Carstairs?" Mrs. Bantry inquired. Carstairs sighed heavily. "Inspector Craddock is pursuing several lines of inquiry. The ransom demand complicates matters. I'm prepared to pay, of course, but the police advise against it." "The sum requested seems curiously modest," Miss Marple observed. "For documents that might rewrite history, as Sir Randolph claimed." "Precisely my point," Professor Wilkins interjected. "Either the thief doesn't understand what they've stolen, or the letters aren't what Carstairs claims they are." Peters finished quietly. An uncomfortable silence fell. Miss Marple's placid expression gave no hint of her thoughts as she glanced around the room, taking in a portrait above the fireplace. "Is that Sir Randolph Petrie?" she inquired. "What a distinguished-looking gentleman." "Yes," Carstairs confirmed. "The portrait was here when I purchased the house. I've developed quite an admiration for him through studying his papers. Such a tragedy about his unexpected death," Miss Marple commented. "Was it not some sort of accident in his library?" "A fall from the gallery," Wilkins supplied. "At least, that was the official finding. Some whispered of suicide, given the mounting skepticism about his claimed discovery." "Or something worse," Peters added softly. "Academic rivalry can be cutthroat in the most literal sense." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Indeed? How fascinating! And where exactly were these letters discovered, Mr. Carstairs?" "Behind a false panel in the library. Would you care to see the location?" "The letters themselves are gone, of course, but—" The shrill ring of the telephone interrupted him. Carstairs excused himself hurriedly. "If you'll pardon me, ladies," Professor Wilkins said stiffly, following Carstairs from the room. Left alone with Gregory Peters, Miss Marple smiled benignly. "You seem very knowledgeable about Sir Randolph's work, Mr. Peters. A particular research interest of yours?" "You could say that," Peters replied, his gaze drifting to the window. "His theories about Henry VII's secret journal could change our understanding of the early Tudor period, if proven correct." "And if the letters are genuine," Miss Marple added quietly. Peters turned to look at her, his expression suddenly sharp. "You have doubts, Miss Marple?" Before she could respond, Carstairs rushed back into the room, his face ashen. "That was Inspector Craddock," he announced. "They found Miss Hardwick's handbag, washed up on the bank of the river." Chapter 4. First Suspects. The discovery of Miss Hardwick's handbag cast a somber pall over St. Mary Mead. The following morning, police divers searched the river but found no trace of the missing librarian. Inspector Craddock established his temporary headquarters at the local police station, conducting interviews with methodical precision. Miss Marple, seated in her garden with a cup of tea, looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps. It was the vicar, Reverend Clement, his kind face drawn with concern. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I've just come from the police station. Inspector Craddock asked to speak with everyone who attended the Historical Society meeting." "Not at all, Leonard. Do join me. How did you find the inspector?" "Most thorough. Particularly interested in who was where after the meeting broke up." He accepted the cup she poured him. "I'm afraid I couldn't be of much help. I walked home with Dr. Haydock, and we parted ways at his surgery." "And the meeting itself?" Miss Marple inquired. "I understand it was rather contentious. Indeed, unpleasantly so." Professor Wilkins was dismissive of the letters from the start, suggesting they were either forgeries or of minimal historical importance. And Miss Hardwick, what was her position? That's what was so peculiar, Reverend Clement reflected. She initially seemed quite excited about the discovery, but then became increasingly agitated as Carstairs described the contents. She interrupted him several times with technical questions about preservation methods and handling protocols. As if she were trying to prevent him from discussing the actual content, Miss Marple suggested gently. The vicar looked startled. "Yes, exactly. How perceptive of you." After the vicar departed, Miss Marple remained thoughtful, until Mrs. Bantry hurried through the garden gate, her expression animated. Jane? "The most extraordinary thing has happened. Gregory Peters came to call on me this morning." "Indeed? What did he want?" "He said he was making inquiries about Sir Randolph Petrie's time at Gossington Hall. Given that Arthur and I purchased the property directly from Sir Randolph's estate, he thought we might have relevant information. He was particularly interested in whether we had found any papers or documents when we moved in. And had you?" "Nothing of significance, as I told him. But I did mention that old diary of the housekeeper's that I found years later in the attic. You remember? The one with all those notes about Sir Randolph's visitors and habits." Miss Marple nodded. "Did Mr. Peters seem interested in this diary?" "Extraordinarily so. He practically insisted on seeing it then and there. I had to explain that I'd donated it to the village historical archive years ago." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "And guess who's in charge of that archive?" "Miss Hardwick," Miss Marple said softly. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the Blue Boar Inn. As she approached, she noticed Professor Wilkins emerging with his coat and hat. "Professor Wilkins," she called, "might I have a word? I believe you knew my late cousin, Professor Mallowan, at Somerville College." Wilkins's expression shifted from impatience to professional courtesy. "I had the pleasure, yes. You must be Jane Marple. How kind of you to remember her mentioning me. I wonder, given your expertise, what you make of these letters Mr. Carstairs has discovered." Wilkins snorted softly. "If they exist at all, which I'm beginning to doubt. Convenient, isn't it? Amazing historical discovery, followed by mysterious theft before any qualified expert can authenticate them." "You suspect Mr. Carstairs of fabricating the entire episode?" "I wouldn't put it past him," Wilkins said grimly. "Carstairs has always had a flair for the dramatic and a tenuous relationship with academic rigor." "How distressing for him," murmured Miss Marple. "And yet, if the letters were merely a publicity stunt, why would Miss Hardwick become involved?" By all accounts, she was most conscientious about historical accuracy. Wilkins's expression darkened. "That's the one element that doesn't fit my theory. Eliza Hardwick was indeed a serious professional, not the type to participate in academic fraud. Then perhaps the letters were genuine? Or perhaps she discovered they weren't and confronted Carstairs." Wilkins checked his watch. "Excuse me, I must catch my train." As he strode away, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to an upstairs window of the inn, where Gregory Peters stood watching Wilkins's departure, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple found her nephew Raymond already seated in the tea-room alongside Inspector Craddock. "I hope you don't mind, Aunt Jane," Raymond said. The inspector and I were just discussing the case." "Hardly invaluable," Miss Marple demurred, settling herself. "Just the observations of an old woman who has perhaps seen too many patterns of human behavior repeat themselves over the years." Craddock smiled. "Those patterns have helped solve more than one case. In fact, we've had a development I'd value your thoughts on." He withdrew a small notebook. "The divers didn't find Miss Hardwick, thankfully, but they did recover a sealed plastic bag containing a single sheet of paper, weighted with a stone. It appears to be one of the missing letters." "Indeed? And was it legible?" "Remarkably so, given its brief immersion. It refers explicitly to the Tudor journal and mentions a secret location where Sir Randolph had concealed it. Most importantly, it's dated just 2 days before Sir Randolph's fatal accident." "How very significant," Miss Marple murmured. "Were there any indications of who might have written it?" "It was signed simply M, presumably a colleague or confidant of Sir Randolph's." Miss Marple's fingers twisted thoughtfully in her lap. "Inspector, has anyone checked whether Miss Hardwick's house keys were in the handbag found by the river?" Craddock looked startled. "They were not. Why do you ask?" "It seems to me," Miss Marple said carefully, "that if one were searching for something that Miss Hardwick might have hidden, access to her cottage would be essential. And if the person who took her handbag retained her keys—" She let the implication hang in the air. Craddock immediately excused himself to make a telephone call. Raymond looked at his aunt with admiration. "You're thinking someone might return to Miss Hardwick's cottage? But surely the police have searched it thoroughly." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "I see, Doris. But if there was something specific they weren't looking for, something only the person who took the letters would know to search for." As darkness fell that evening, a figure moved silently through Miss Hardwick's garden, approaching the rear docker of her cottage. The soft click of a key in the lock was barely audible in the stillness. Inside, Constable Jenkins, stationed there on Inspector Craddock's orders, following Miss Marple's suggestion, tensed in anticipation. The beam of a flashlight swept across the darkened sitting room. Jenkins stepped forward. "Stop right there, please." The figure whirled, and in the moment before the flashlight clattered to the floor, Jenkins recognized the intruder with shock. "You?" he exclaimed. "But why?" The heavy paperweight caught him squarely on the temple, and Constable Jenkins crumpled to the floor. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The attack on Constable Jenkins caused a ripple of alarm throughout St. Mary Mead. What had begun as the theft of historical documents had escalated to assault on a police officer, and Miss Hardwick's disappearance took on an even more sinister aspect. "Fortunately, Jenkins will recover," Inspector Craddock told Miss Marple as they walked through her garden the following morning. "Concussion and a nasty gash, but the doctor says there should be no lasting damage. Unfortunately, he only caught the briefest glimpse of his attacker before being struck down." "But he did recognize the person?" Miss Marple asked, carefully deadheading a rose without looking up. "He thinks so, but he's not entirely certain. It was dark, and he admits his identification might not be reliable." Craddock hesitated. "He believes it may have been Carstairs himself." Miss Marple's secateurs paused mid-snip. "Indeed? How very interesting." "We've brought Carstairs in for questioning, of course. He claims he was at home all evening, working on his manuscript. The housekeeper confirms this, but she retired early, so her testimony only covers until 9 o'clock. "And what time was Constable Jenkins attacked?" "Shortly after 11. Craddock sighed. "The forensics team is going over Miss Hardwick's cottage now. Whatever the intruder was looking for, we intend to find it first." After the inspector departed, Miss Marple remained thoughtful, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she sat. In her parlor, the telephone's sharp ring interrupted her contemplation. "Miss Marple?" It was Raymond's voice. "I wonder if you might join me for lunch at the Blue Boar. There's someone I'd like you to meet." Intrigued, Miss Marple agreed. Upon arriving at the inn, she found Raymond waiting in the dining room with a smartly dressed woman in her late 30s, Aunt Jane, this is Margaret Holloway from the British Library. Margaret, my aunt, Miss Jane Marple." "Miss Holloway is an expert in medieval manuscripts," Raymond explained as they settled at the table. "I contacted her after our conversation yesterday. I thought her expertise might be valuable." "How kind of you to spare the time, Miss Holloway," Miss Marple said warmly. "I was already planning to visit Oxford this week," Margaret Holloway replied. When Raymond explained about these mysterious letters, I was immediately interested. Sir Randolph Petrie's claim about a Tudor royal journal has been the subject of academic speculation for decades. "You don't believe such a journal exists?" Miss Marple inquired. "I keep an open mind, but the evidence has always been tenuous at best." Sir Randolph was a respected scholar, but his final claim, made shortly before his death, struck many as implausible. Tudor royal documents have been extensively catalogued and studied. "And yet," Miss Marple mused, "if Henry VII wished to keep certain thoughts private—" "Exactly," Miss Holloway nodded approvingly, "which is why the possibility, however remote, remains intriguing. If these letters Carstairs discovered contain concrete information about the journal's whereabouts—" The conversation was interrupted as Gregory Peters entered the dining room. He hesitated upon seeing their group, then approached with a polite smile. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise. Raymond." He nodded to Miss Marple's nephew before turning to Miss Holloway with obvious curiosity. Raymond performed the introductions. Peters's expression sharpened with interest. "The British Library? How fascinating. I'd value your perspective on the Petrie letters, Miss Holloway, assuming they ever resurface." "You seem quite interested in these letters, Mr. Peters." Miss Marple observed mildly. Peters smiled disarmingly. "Professional curiosity. My thesis advisor at Columbia was a great admirer of Sir Randolph's work. When I heard about Carstairs' discovery, I couldn't resist investigating, even extending your stay despite the unfortunate developments." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but her pale blue eyes were suddenly penetrating, especially because of them, Peters admitted. "Call it the academic detective in me. These letters could solve a historical mystery that's remained unanswered for almost a century." After lunch, as Miss Marple was preparing to leave, the innkeeper approached her discreetly. "Excuse me, Miss Marple, there's a telephone call for—" "You?" It was Inspector Craddock. "We've made a discovery at Miss Hardwick's cottage," he said without preamble. A hidden compartment in an antique writing desk. It contained a small notebook. Appears to be some sort of private journal. Miss Hardwick's handwriting. Recent entries. I thought you might be interested." "How very thoughtful of you, Inspector. I shall come right away." At the police station, Craddock showed her into his temporary office and carefully placed a small leather-bound notebook on the desk between them. The last entry was made 3 days ago, the day of the historical society meeting, he explained. Most of it concerns routine library matters, but there are several references to Carstairs and his research. Miss Marple peered at the neat, precise handwriting. "May I?" At Craddock's nod, she turned the pages, slowly reading with careful attention. "How interesting," she murmured, pausing at an entry dated a week earlier. "C. showed me the letters today. Remarkable similarity to the Millbrook forgeries, though much more sophisticated. Must consult BL records before raising concerns." "BL? British Library," Craddock suggested. "It would seem likely," Miss Marple agreed, continuing to read. Telephone conversation with Peters most disturbing. His interest in the housekeeper's diary now makes sense. "If Sir Randolph truly did—" The entry ended abruptly. Miss Marple turned to the final entry, dated the day of the meeting. "Have confirmed my suspicions through M.H. Will confront C. after the presentation tonight. The implications are far more serious than a mere academic fraud." "M.H.," Craddock mused. "Any ideas?" "Perhaps Margaret Holloway," Miss Marple suggested. "She's an expert in medieval manuscripts from the British Library. My nephew Raymond brought her to lunch today. Quite coincidentally," the inspector looked at her sharply. Coincidentally, I've learned to be skeptical of coincidences where you're concerned, Miss Marple. Miss Marple smiled gently. Raymond has always had an interest in historical mysteries, but I confess I was hoping to learn more about the British Library's records of the Millbrook forgeries, which Miss Hardwick mentions. I'll speak with Miss Holloway immediately, Craddock said, rising, and I think we need to have another conversation with Mr. Peters as well. Before you do, Miss Marple said hesitantly, there's one other matter that seems significant. In her notation about confronting C after the presentation, the most obvious assumption is that she meant Carstairs. Naturally, Craddock agreed. But, Miss Marple continued, consider the context. If Miss Hardwick had discovered evidence of forgery and suspected Carstairs was responsible, would she have warned him of her suspicions in advance? Craddock frowned. You think C might refer to someone else? Before Miss Marple could respond, the door opened and a police constable entered hurriedly. Inspector, we've just had word. A woman's body has been found in the woods near Gossington Hall. Craddock's expression hardened. Miss Hardwick? No, sir. That's the strange thing. It's the housekeeper from Gossington Hall, Mrs. Carson. And, sir, the constable lowered his voice, Mr. Carstairs is missing. His car is gone, and there's blood in the library. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The death of Mrs. Carson, Carstairs' housekeeper, transformed the case. What had begun as theft and disappearance was now unquestionably murder, and Edmund Carstairs had become the prime suspect. Police bulletins described his car and warned the public not to approach him. Miss Marple sat quietly in her cottage, her knitting momentarily set aside, as she gazed thoughtfully at the evening newspaper with its glaring headline, Manhunt for Missing Author in Village Murder. The doorbell's ring startled her from her contemplation. When she opened the door, she found Margaret Holloway on her doorstep, looking distressed. Miss Marple, I hope you don't mind my calling unannounced. Inspector Craddock interviewed me this afternoon about Eliza Hardwick's journal entries. Not at all, my dear. Please come in. Miss Marple led her visitor to the parlor. I imagine the inspector had several questions about the Millbrook forgeries mentioned in the journal. Yes, Margaret confirmed, settling into an armchair. It was a notorious case in academic circles about 15 years ago. A series of letters purportedly written by Cardinal Wolsey were offered to various institutions. They were exceptionally well-crafted forgeries, good enough to fool several experts initially. And was the forger ever identified? Eventually, yes. A brilliant but unscrupulous historian named Charles Millbrook. He had the specialized knowledge to create historically plausible documents and access to period paper and inks through his museum connections. Margaret hesitated. The curious thing is, after he was exposed, Millbrook disappeared. There were rumors he'd gone to America. How very interesting, murmured Miss Marple. And Miss Hardwick noted a similarity between those forgeries and the letters Mr. Carstairs discovered, which is deeply concerning, Margaret said. If she was correct, it suggests someone with extraordinary skill created these letters, a level of expertise beyond what I'd expect from Carstairs, frankly. Perhaps he had an accomplice, Miss Marple suggested. Perhaps. But why would Mrs. Carson be killed? What could a housekeeper know about historical forgeries? Miss Marple's fingers twisted thoughtfully in her lap. Unless she witnessed something she wasn't meant to see, the housekeeper in a great house often observes far more than people realize. The telephone's ring interrupted their conversation. Miss Marple excused herself to answer it. Aunt Jane? It was Raymond, his voice tense. I've just had the most extraordinary encounter. Gregory Peters came to my room at the Blue Boar, looking absolutely desperate. He claimed Carstairs isn't the murderer, and that he needs to speak with you urgently. Then he heard something in the corridor and fled through the window. After replacing the receiver, Miss Marple turned to find Margaret Holloway standing in the doorway, her expression guarded. Is everything all right, Miss Marple? A small concern with my nephew, Miss Marple replied mildly. Nothing serious. They returned to the parlor, but their conversation was soon interrupted by another visitor. Inspector Craddock appeared, looking weary but determined. "Good evening, Miss Marple, Miss Holloway. I'm following up on some new information." He glanced at Margaret. "I didn't expect to find you here, but it's convenient. We've been analyzing Mrs. Carson's personal effects and found something interesting." He withdrew a small envelope from his pocket. This receipt was in her handbag. It's for a safety deposit box at the Barchester Bank, rented just 2 days ago. "After the Historical Society meeting," Miss Marple noted. "Precisely. We've obtained a warrant to examine the contents. I'm driving to Barchester first thing tomorrow." "Morning." After the inspector and Margaret Holloway departed, Miss Marple sat for a long while, her brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, she reached for the telephone and dialed Mrs. Bantry's number. "Dolly, I wonder if you might do me a small favor tomorrow morning." The following day dawned bright and clear. Mrs. Bantry collected Miss Marple promptly at 9, and they set off for Barchester, the market town 10 miles from St. Mary Mead. "I still don't understand why we're going to the Historical Records Office," Mrs. Bantry said, as she navigated the winding country road. "Surely the police will find whatever is important in that safety deposit box." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed. "But I believe there's another piece to this puzzle, one that Inspector Craddock might not think to look for." At the records office, a helpful young clerk responded to Miss Marple's inquiry about documents relating to Gossington Hall's ownership. "We do have the property records, madam, though they only go back to the early 1900s. Anything earlier would be in the county archives." "That should be sufficient," Miss Marple assured him. "I'm particularly interested in the period when Sir Randolph Petrie owned the Pushpah's property and any conditions of sale when it passed to Colonel Bantry." While they waited for the documents to be retrieved, Mrs. Bantry browsed through a display of local historical photographs. "Jane, look at this. It's Gossington as it appeared." "In the 1920s?" Miss Marple examined the photograph with interest. "How curious! The west wing appears quite different from its current configuration." "Oh, yes," Mrs. Bantry confirmed. "Sir Randolph had extensive renovations done shortly before his death. Arthur always said they were a frightful waste of money, tearing down perfectly sound walls to create that grand library." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "The library where Mr. Carstairs found the hidden letters?" "The very same. Sir Randolph designed it himself, insisted on overseeing every detail. Arthur thought it dreadfully pretentious with all those secret panels and hidden drawers. Like something from a melodrama, he used to say." Before Miss Marple could respond, the clerk returned with a folder of documents. She examined them carefully, her expression becoming increasingly thoughtful. "How very interesting," she murmured, pointing to a notation in the margin of one page. "Look, Dolly, there's a covenant in the deed, a condition that the library must be preserved in its exact form without alterations for a period of 50 years after Sir Randolph's death." "Yes, I vaguely remember Arthur grumbling about that," Mrs. Bantry said. "It's why we never converted it into a billiards room as he wanted." Miss Marple checked the date on the document. "And that 50-year period expired last year," Mrs. Bantry finished. "Which means Carstairs would have been free to make changes to the library for the first time since it was built." Miss Marple's fingers twisted in excitement. "Dolly, we must telephone Inspector Craddock immediately." They hurried back to their car, but as they approached, Miss Marple suddenly grasped Mrs. Bantry's arm. "Wait," she whispered. "That man by the newspaper stand, isn't that Gregory Peters?" Mrs. Bantry squinted. "I believe it is, and he seems to be watching us." "How very significant," Miss Marple murmured. "I think perhaps we should speak with him." But as they started in his direction, Peters turned and walked rapidly away, disappearing around a corner. By the time they reached the spot, he was nowhere to be seen. "Most peculiar behavior," Mrs. Bantry remarked. "Almost as if he were following us." "Or watching to see what we might discover," Miss Marple suggested. When they returned to St. Mary Mead that afternoon, they found the village in a state of heightened tension. A police car was parked outside the vicarage, and several neighbors stood in small groups talking in hushed voices. "What's happened?" Mrs. Bantry asked, stopping beside Mrs. Price Ridley. "Edmund Carstairs has been found," the elderly woman replied, with grim satisfaction, "hiding in the old gamekeeper's cottage on the Gossington estate. And you'll never guess who found him. Miss Hardwick. She wasn't dead after all, just held prisoner there. Managed to escape this morning when Carstairs left briefly." "How extraordinary!" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. "Is she injured?" "Suffering from exposure and dehydration, according to Dr. Haydock, but otherwise unharmed. She's at the vicarage now, giving her statement to Inspector Craddock." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes gleamed with sudden understanding. "And Mr. Carstairs?" "Arrested, of course. They're saying he confessed to everything, forging the letters, killing his housekeeper when she discovered the truth, even attacking." That poor policeman. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned closer. "They found the missing letters hidden in the cottage, along with Sir Randolph's journal itself." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple stood quite still, her expression troubled. "No," she said softly to herself, "that can't possibly be right." Chapter 7. Another Twist. "You don't believe Carstairs is guilty?" Mrs. Bantry asked incredulously as they walked back to Miss Marple's cottage. "But he's confessed, and Miss Hardwick identified him as her kidnapper." "It's not that I don't believe." "He's guilty of something," Miss Marple replied carefully. "But there are several elements that don't quite fit together. Why would Carstairs hide Miss Hardwick rather than—" She stopped abruptly. "Well, rather than ensure her silence more permanently," Mrs. Bantry shuddered, "perhaps he couldn't bring himself to commit another murder." "Perhaps. But there's also the matter of the safety deposit box. If Mrs. Carson discovered his forgery, and he killed her for it, why would she have rented that box just before her death? And what did she place inside it?" Miss Marple's questions remained unanswered that evening, but the following morning brought Inspector Craddock to her door, his expression grim. "You were right about the safety deposit box," he said without preamble, as he accepted a cup of tea. "It contained photographs, several detailed images of the letters Carstairs claimed to have found, along with notes in Mrs. Carson's handwriting." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And what did these notes say?" "They described overhearing arguments between Carstairs and someone else, a man she refers to only as the American. According to Mrs. Carson, this person was pressuring Carstairs about the letters and something called the real treasure." "Gregory Peters," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "He was most insistent with Mrs. Bantry about that old housekeeper's diary. We're looking for him." "Now," Craddock confirmed. "He checked out of the Blue Boar yesterday and hasn't been seen since." The inspector hesitated. "There's something else. The contents of Sir Randolph's journal, the one found in the gamekeeper's cottage, have been examined by experts from London. They've declared it a modern forgery." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "And the letters?" "Also forgeries, though. Exceptionally well-crafted ones." Craddock leaned forward. When confronted with this evidence, Carstairs changed his story. He now claims Peters was the mastermind, that the American forced him to participate in the scheme by threatening to expose some past indiscretion. "And what does Miss Hardwick say about all this?" Miss Marple inquired. "That's where it gets complicated," Craddock admitted. "She insists Carstairs was her kidnapper, but her account of the days she spent captive is confused. Dr. Haydock believes she may have been drugged, which would explain her disorientation and memory gaps." After the inspector departed, Miss Marple sat for a long while, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she arranged the facts in her mind. The telephone's ring interrupted her thoughts. Miss Marple. It was Margaret Holloway. "I wonder if I might stop by this afternoon. There's something rather important I need to discuss with you." "Of course, my dear. Shall we say 3 o'clock?" At the appointed time, Miss Marple was surprised to find not only Margaret Holloway at her door, but also Raymond. "I hope you don't." "Mind me accompanying Margaret," Raymond said as they settled in the parlor. "She's made a rather startling discovery." Margaret nodded, her expression serious. After our conversation about the Millbrook forgeries, I contacted a former colleague who was involved in that investigation. He sent me some old photographs. She withdrew a manila envelope from her handbag, including this one of Charles Millbrook, taken before his disappearance. She handed a slightly faded photograph to Miss Marple, who examined it carefully. It showed a handsome young man with sharp features and intelligent eyes. "The resemblance is remarkable, isn't it?" Margaret prompted. Miss Marple looked up, her expression thoughtful. "Indeed it is, though people do sometimes have doubles, of course." "Aunt Jane," Raymond interjected, "you can't possibly think this is mere coincidence. The man in that photograph is clearly a younger version of—" The doorbell's insistent ring interrupted him. When Miss Marple opened the door, she found the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, looking flustered. "Jane, I'm so sorry to disturb you, but something most peculiar has happened. Eliza Hardwick has disappeared from the vicarage." "Disappeared?" Miss Marple echoed. "Leonard was showing Inspector Craddock out, and I went to check on her. She'd been resting in our guest room, but the window was open and she was gone. And the strangest thing, she left this note addressed to you." Mrs. Clement handed over a folded piece of paper. Miss Marple read the brief message with raised eyebrows. "The west wall. Not where, but when. E.H." "Does that make any sense to you?" Mrs. Clement asked. "I believe it might," Miss Marple said slowly. "Mrs. Clement, would you be so kind as to telephone Inspector Craddock? Tell him Miss Hardwick has gone to Gossington Hall, to the library." After Mrs. Clement hurried off, Miss Marple turned to Raymond and Margaret. "I must go to Gossington immediately. Raymond, would you drive me?" "Of course, but what's happening, Aunt Jane?" Raymond asked as they moved quickly to his car. "I believe Miss Hardwick has finally remembered something vital," Miss Marple replied. "Something about Sir Randolph's library that connects to this entire mystery." When they arrived at Gossington Hall, they found the building eerily quiet. Police tape crossed the entrance to the library where Mrs. Carson's body had been discovered, but there was no sign of an officer on guard. "They must have deployed everyone to search for Miss Hardwick," Raymond observed. "Wait here, both of you," Miss Marple instructed. "If Inspector Craddock arrives, tell him I've gone to examine the library's west wall." "Aunt Jane, you can't go in there alone," Raymond protested. "It's a crime scene, and if Peters is still at large—" "I believe I must," Miss Marple said firmly. "Miss Hardwick's note was addressed to me specifically. She wants me to see something." The library was a magnificent room, 2 stories high, with a gallery running around 3 sides. Heavy drapes were drawn across the windows, leaving the space in semi-darkness. Miss Marple moved carefully, avoiding the area near the large desk, where traces of chalk on the floor marked where Mrs. Carson's body had been found. The west wall was dominated by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, broken only by an ornate fireplace in the center. Miss Marple examined it carefully, recalling Mrs. Bantry's comment about Sir Randolph's fondness for secret panels and hidden compartments. "Not where but when," she murmured to herself. "What could that possibly—" A slight noise from the gallery above made her look up sharply. A figure stood in the shadows, watching her. "I knew you would come, Miss Marple," said Eliza Hardwick, her voice unnaturally calm. "You're the only one who could understand. My dear, everyone is looking for you." Miss Marple replied gently. "Why did you leave the vicarage?" "Because I finally remembered." Miss Hardwick descended the stairs slowly. "The drugs they gave me, they made everything so foggy. But when I saw the photograph of Sir Randolph in the vicar's study, it all came back to me." She approached the west wall, running her fingers along the edge of a bookshelf. "It's not about the letters. It never was. They're just forgeries. Clever ones. But forgeries nonetheless. The real treasure is what Sir Randolph built this library to conceal." "The Tudor journal?" Miss Marple suggested. Miss Hardwick smiled thinly. "That was just a story. Sir Randolph's cover for his real discovery, something far more valuable." Her fingers found a small, almost invisible catch. "Something worth killing for." both then and now. As a section of the bookshelf swung silently outward, Miss Marple heard rapid footsteps in the hallway outside. "Miss Hardwick," she said urgently, "who kidnapped you? Was it really Edmund Carstairs?" Before Miss Hardwick could answer, a familiar voice spoke from the doorway. "No, Miss Marple, it wasn't Carstairs at all." Miss Marple turned to see Gregory Peters standing there, a small revolver in his hand. "I'm afraid our American friend has been rather economical with the truth," Miss Hardwick said, with surprising composure, "just as his grandfather was, all those years ago." Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. "Grandfather?" Miss Marple repeated softly, her pale blue eyes moving between Miss Hardwick and Gregory Peters. "How very interesting." Peters gestured with the revolver. "Step away from that panel, both of you." His voice had lost its pleasant academic tone, replaced by something harder and more commanding. "You're Charles Millbrook's grandson," Miss Marple continued calmly, moving slightly to position herself between Peters and Miss Hardwick. "The man who created the Millbrook forgeries." "Very good, Miss Marple." Peters smiled without warmth. "Though Millbrook was just one of many names my grandfather used. He was born Gregory Peterson, my namesake." "And also Sir Randolph Petrie's assistant," Miss Hardwick added, "the man who supposedly discovered his body after the fatal fall." Peters nodded approvingly. "You've done your homework, Miss Hardwick. That's what made you so dangerous. When you started asking questions about that old housekeeper's diary, it mentioned your grandfather frequently," Miss Hardwick explained to Miss Marple. "His arguments with Sir Randolph in the weeks before the accident. The housekeeper thought they were academic disagreements, but she didn't realize what they were really fighting about." "Which was?" Miss Marple prompted. Peters laughed shortly. "Why don't I show you, since you've come this far?" He gestured toward the partially opened panel. "After you, ladies." With remarkable steadiness for her age, Miss Marple stepped forward and pushed the panel wider. Behind it was a narrow space containing not books, but a small iron door set into the wall, with an old-fashioned dial lock. "The combination is Sir Randolph's birth date," Peters instructed, 18/7/1869. Miss Hardwick stepped forward and carefully turned the dial. The lock clicked, and the door swung open to reveal a small vault built into the thickness of the wall itself. Inside, resting on a velvet cloth, was a wooden box about 12 inches square. Miss Hardwick reached for it with trembling hands. "Careful," Peters warned. "It's survived nearly a century in there. The contents are extremely fragile." Miss Hardwick set the box on a nearby table and gently lifted the lid. Miss Marple moved closer, her curiosity evident despite the tension of the situation. Inside, nestled in more velvet, was what appeared to be a small book, bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. "Is that—" Miss Marple began. "Not Henry VII's journal," Peters said. "Something far older and more valuable. A 9th-century illuminated gospel, one of only 7 known to exist. Its last recorded location was the monastery at Lindisfarne. Before the Viking raids, it was thought destroyed." "Sir Randolph discovered it," Miss Hardwick whispered, "and kept it secret." "He found it during an excavation in Northumberland," Peters confirmed. "A private dig on land belonging to a friend. Instead of reporting the find as law required, he kept it hidden, planning to study it himself before revealing it to the world." "And your grandfather discovered his secret," Miss Marple said. Peters' expression hardened. "Sir Randolph promised to share the credit for the discovery. Then he changed his mind, accused my grandfather of attempting to steal it. They argued that night in this very library. Sir Randolph fell, or was pushed, from that gallery." He gestured upward with the revolver. "But your grandfather couldn't find the manuscript," Miss Marple concluded. "Sir Randolph had already hidden it in this secret vault." "Exactly." Peters's voice was bitter. "My grandfather searched for years, cultivating his skills as a forger while trying to discover where it might be hidden. The Tudor journal story was Sir Randolph's own creation, a deliberate misdirection." And when the 50-year covenant expired, allowing alterations to the library, Miss Marple began. I knew it was my chance, Peters finished. I needed access to Gossington Hall, to this library specifically. Carstairs provided that opportunity. The forged letters were bait to establish a connection to Sir Randolph's research. Miss Hardwick closed the box carefully. But Mrs. Carson overheard you arguing with Carstairs. She suspected something was wrong. Poor Mrs. Carson, Peters said, without remorse. She was bringing tea to the library that evening and heard too much. I couldn't allow her to interfere. We were so close to the deadline. Deadline? Miss Marple inquired mildly. The covenant expired on March 15th, precisely 50 years after Sir Randolph's death. After that date, Carstairs could have begun renovations, potentially discovering the manuscript himself. The sound of a car engine outside made Peters glance nervously toward the window. "We need to go," he said abruptly. "Miss Hardwick, carry the box. Miss Marple, you'll come with us until we're safely away." "I'm afraid my rheumatism would make me a dreadfully slow hostage," Miss Marple said apologetically. "Perhaps you should reconsider." "No arguments?" Peters gestured with the revolver. "Move toward the side door, slowly." As they began to move, Miss Marple stumbled slightly, catching herself on the edge of a bookshelf. A small ornamental paperweight toppled from the shelf, rolling across the floor with a loud clatter. "Clumsy old woman!" Peters snapped momentarily, distracted by the noise. In that instant, Miss Hardwick acted with surprising swiftness. She swung the wooden box directly at Peters's arm. He cried out, the revolver discharging harmlessly into the ceiling before clattering to the floor. Before he could recover, the library door burst open. Inspector Craddock rushed in, flanked by 2 constables. "Gregory Peters, I'm arresting you for the murder of Mrs. Carson and the kidnapping of Miss Hardwick," Craddock announced, as the constables seized the struggling American. "Perfect timing, Inspector," Miss Marple said with satisfaction, "though I must credit Miss Hardwick's quick thinking for disarming our culprit." As Peters was led away, still protesting vehemently, Raymond and Margaret Holloway entered the library, followed by Edmund Carstairs, looking pale but composed. "Are you all right, Aunt Jane?" Raymond asked anxiously. "Perfectly fine, thank you, dear." Miss Marple turned to Inspector Craddock. "I believe Mr. Carstairs has been cleared of the murder charge." Craddock nodded grimly. "He's admitted to participating in the forgery scheme, but his alibi for the time of Mrs. Carson's death has been confirmed. He was at his publisher's office in London." "I'm not proud of my role in this," Carstairs said quietly. "Peters approached me months ago, claiming to have evidence of letters written by Sir Randolph. His knowledge of the house and its history seemed authentic. When I expressed doubts about the letters' provenance, he threatened to expose a plagiarism scandal from my university days." "And Miss Hardwick?" Miss Marple inquired, turning to the librarian. "How did you come to suspect the truth?" Miss Hardwick sat down heavily, the strain of recent events evident in her face. "The letters themselves first aroused my suspicion, certain anachronisms in phrasing. Then I recognized similarities to the Millbrook forgeries I'd studied during my doctoral research. When I consulted Margaret at the British Library, she confirmed my concerns." "You knew each other previously?" Miss Marple asked, glancing between Miss Hardwick and Margaret Holloway. "We were colleagues years ago," Margaret confirmed. "When Eliza contacted me about the letters, I didn't immediately connect them to Peters. It was only after she disappeared that I began researching more deeply into the Millbrook case and discovered the family connection." "And then Peters kidnapped you," Miss Marple said to Miss Hardwick, "to prevent you from exposing the forgeries." "Yes. He was waiting outside my cottage that night. He forced me to write the ransom note, then kept me drugged at the gamekeeper's cottage while he continued searching for the manuscript." Miss Hardwick shuddered at the memory. "It was only when I heard about Mrs. Carson's murder that I realized how dangerous he truly was." "Well, but how did you escape?" Craddock asked. "He became careless as his desperation grew. Yesterday morning he left me alone briefly." The drugs were wearing off, and I managed to flee. I knew I needed to reach the library to confirm what I'd begun to suspect about the West Wall. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. In Sir Randolph's time, the West Wall would have been the most secure location, furthest from exterior walls, protected from dampness and light. A perfect hiding place for a priceless manuscript. Craddock examined the ancient gospel with careful hands. This will need to be turned over to the proper authorities. The British Museum will want to authenticate it immediately. As the bustle of police activity continued around them, Miss Marple drew Miss Hardwick aside. "There's one detail that still puzzles me, my dear. Your note, not where, but when." "What exactly did you mean?" Miss Hardwick smiled wearily. "The combination to the vault. Sir Randolph's birth date, 18/7/1869. Peters had been trying every possible hiding place in the library, but never considered that the key wasn't a location, but a date. The answer was in the when, not the where." "Most ingenious," Miss Marple murmured, "though I suspect Sir Randolph would be dismayed to see his precious secret finally revealed." Outside the window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Gossington Hall, illuminating a history far older and more complex than anyone had imagined. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The following evening found a curious gathering in Miss Marple's cottage. Inspector Craddock had requested this informal meeting to tie up loose ends, as he put it. Seated around Miss Marple's parlor were the inspector, himself Miss Hardwick, looking much recovered after a day's proper rest, Edmund Carstairs, Margaret Holloway, Raymond, and Mrs. Bantry, who had insisted on attending once she heard about the dramatic events at Gossington Hall. "The manuscript has been authenticated by experts from the British Museum," Craddock informed them, accepting a cup of tea from Miss Marple. "Their preliminary assessment confirms it's a 9th century gospel of extraordinary significance." "And its value?" Mrs. Bantry couldn't resist asking. "Essentially priceless," Margaret replied. "Beyond monetary consideration, really. Its historical and cultural importance is immeasurable." "Which explains why a man would kill for it," Miss Marple observed quietly. "Both in Sir Randolph's time and our own," Craddock nodded grimly. "Peters is being remarkably forthcoming now that the game is up. He's admitted to killing Mrs. Carson and kidnapping Miss Hardwick. He's also implied that his grandfather was responsible for Sir Randolph's death, though of course that case is long past any legal proceedings." "And yet," Miss Marple said, her knitting needles moving steadily in her thin hands, "I find myself wondering if we have the complete picture, even now." "What do you mean, Aunt Jane?" Raymond asked. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at Miss Hardwick. "When Peters was explaining about the manuscript, he mentioned that Sir Randolph found it during a private dig on land belonging to a friend. I wonder if we know which friend?" Miss Hardwick looked startled. I'm not certain. The historical records never specified." "I believe I might know," said Carstairs unexpectedly. "In my research on Sir Randolph, I came across references to his friendship with Lord Melchett, who owned an estate in Northumberland. There were several letters mentioning archaeological surveys conducted there." "The Melchett estate," Miss Marple murmured. "How very interesting. And the current Lord Melchett would be—" "Charles Melchett," Margaret Holloway supplied. "He's on the board of trustees at the British Library, a noted patron of historical preservation. And," Miss Marple added softly, "if I'm not mistaken, the father-in-law of our own Professor Wilkins." A momentary silence fell over the room as the implications settled. "Wilkins?" Craddock said sharply. "Are you suggesting he was involved in this as well?" "I'm merely noting connections, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But it does seem curious that Professor Wilkins was so eager to discredit the letters from the beginning, before he had even examined them properly. And he was certainly quick to leave once the investigation intensified," Raymond observed. "If the manuscript was discovered on Melchett land," Miss Hardwick said slowly, "legally it would belong to the Melchett estate, not to Sir Randolph personally. By keeping it secret, Sir Randolph was essentially stealing it." which would give the Melchett family a strong claim to it now that it's been found," Margaret added. Inspector Craddock frowned. "This puts rather a different complexion on things. I should perhaps have a conversation with Professor Wilkins." "I believe that might be wise," Miss Marple agreed. "Though I suspect you'll find he's already aware of the manuscript's discovery. The telephone in the Blue Boar's lobby is not particularly private, and I noticed him making a call shortly after we returned from Gossington Hall yesterday." Carstairs had been listening intently. "This may explain something that's been puzzling me. 2 months ago, before any of this business with the letters began, I received an offer to purchase Gossington Hall, significantly above market value. The offer came through a London solicitor who wouldn't name his client. Did you consider accepting?" Mrs. Bantry asked curiously. "I might have, had I not been so engrossed in my work," Carstairs admitted. "As it happened, I declined without giving it much thought." "So someone else was also seeking access to the library," Miss Marple concluded. "How very thorough." Craddock set down his teacup decisively. "I believe I need to make some telephone calls, if you'll excuse me." After the inspector departed, conversation continued in a more relaxed fashion. Miss Hardwick moved to sit beside Miss Marple. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you," she said quietly. "How did you know to look for a hidden vault in the west wall? I never specifically mentioned it in my note." "Several small observations came together," Miss Marple explained. "Mrs. Bantry mentioned Sir Randolph's extensive renovations, focusing on the library. Then there was the photograph we saw at the records office showing the West Wing's original configuration. The wall appeared much thinner before the renovations. When your note mentioned the west wall, and not where but when, I suspected Sir Randolph had built a hiding place into the new structure." "It was brilliantly deduced," Miss Hardwick said admiringly. "Not at all," Miss Marple demurred. "Simply a matter of observing patterns. People are remarkably similar in their behaviors, you know. The desire to possess beautiful things, to own them exclusively, has led to tragedy throughout human history." Later, as the gathering was breaking up, Raymond lingered behind. "You were magnificent, Aunt Jane," he said affectionately, "though I shudder to think of you facing a desperate man with a revolver." "It wasn't nearly as dramatic as it sounds," Miss Marple assured him. "I could see Inspector Craddock's car approaching through the library window. It was simply a matter of keeping Peters talking until help arrived. And that clumsy stumble that distracted him, I suspect that wasn't accidental at all." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "One advantage of being elderly is that people expect a certain physical awkwardness. It can be quite useful in the right circumstances." The following morning brought news that Professor Wilkins had been detained at Heathrow Airport, attempting to leave the country. In his possession were detailed photographs of the manuscript and a letter confirming his appointment to meet with Lord Melchett. "It appears you were correct about Wilkins's involvement," Inspector Craddock told Miss Marple, "when he visited to update her, though he insists he was merely protecting his father-in-law's legitimate claim to the manuscript." "And what will happen to it now?" Miss Marple inquired. "That will be for the courts to decide," Craddock replied. "The British Museum has taken temporary custody, but the Melchett estate will almost certainly file a claim, as will the church, given the manuscript's religious significance." "And Mr. Peters?" "Facing multiple charges: murder, kidnapping, forgery. He's attempting to negotiate by offering information about other forged documents his grandfather placed in various collections over the years." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "A sad ending to what began as an academic project. Sir Randolph's desire to keep his discovery secret ultimately led to his death. And nearly a century later, that same secrecy claimed another victim." "Mrs. Carson was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time," Craddock observed grimly. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "though in my experience, Inspector, timing is rarely as coincidental as it appears. Mrs. Carson had worked at Gossington Hall for many years. I suspect she may have known or guessed more than Peters realized." As Inspector Craddock took his leave, Miss Marple returned to her garden. The spring sunshine fell warmly on the budding roses as she carefully pruned a wayward branch. From the lane beyond her gate came the sound of voices, village life continuing, as it always had. The excitement of murder and ancient treasures would fade, replaced by more mundane concerns. But for those involved, the consequences of Sir Randolph's secret would echo far beyond the peaceful boundaries of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple glanced toward Gossington Hall, its chimneys visible above the trees in the distance. The house had witnessed so much over the centuries, joy and sorrow, birth and death, secrets kept and finally revealed. Like people, she reflected, houses accumulated their own histories, layer upon layer. And sometimes those layers concealed truths that were never meant to be disturbed. Chapter 10. Return to Normalcy. Fortnight after the dramatic events at Gossington Hall, St. Mary Mead had settled back into its customary rhythm. The excitement of murder, kidnapping, and ancient treasures gradually faded from daily conversation, replaced by more typical village concerns, the upcoming flower show, Reverend Clement's sermons, and the perennial gossip about who might be invited to the annual garden party at the manor house. Miss Marple sat in her garden, enjoying the late afternoon sunshine. Her roses were doing particularly well this year, and she surveyed them with quiet satisfaction as she worked on a small piece of knitting. The gate clicked open, and Miss Hardwick appeared, looking remarkably recovered. Her ordeal had left few visible traces, though a certain wariness remained in her eyes. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, my dear. Please join me. The tea tray should be arriving momentarily." As if on cue, Miss Marple's faithful maid brought out a tray and set it on the garden table. "You're looking much better," Miss Marple observed as she poured the tea. "I feel it," Miss Hardwick agreed. "The library reopens tomorrow. Inspector Craddock has finally removed all the police tape and given his permission. I've been cataloging the collection all week. That must be quite the undertaking." "It is, but it's helping me reclaim the space in a way, making it a place of knowledge again rather than—" She trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. "Rather than a place." "Of deception and death," Miss Marple finished gently. "Yes, I understand. Places, like people, can be transformed by the events that occur within them, but they can also be healed." Miss Hardwick sipped her tea thoughtfully. "I've had a letter from the British Museum. They've invited me to consult on the manuscript's preservation. Apparently, my work on medieval texts is more highly regarded than I realized." "How wonderful," Miss Marple said warmly. "A well-deserved recognition of your expertise." "It's largely thanks to you," Miss Hardwick insisted. "If you hadn't understood my note, if you hadn't come to the library when you did—" "I think you would have managed quite admirably without my intervention," Miss Marple replied. "You showed remarkable presence of mind in disarming Mr. Peters." "Speaking of Peters," Miss Hardwick said, her expression growing serious, "have you heard the latest? He's made a full confession, but with an unexpected twist. He claims his grandfather didn't actually kill Sir Randolph. According to family lore, Sir Randolph accidentally fell during their argument, and his grandfather, fearing he would be blamed, fled the scene." "How very convenient," Miss Marple murmured, "though I suppose it's possible. We shall never know with certainty now." The sound of an approaching car interrupted their conversation. A sleek black Bentley pulled up outside the gate, and Edmund Carstairs emerged, carrying a small parcel. "Miss Marple, Miss Hardwick," he greeted them. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to say goodbye before I leave." "You're departing St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple inquired, gesturing for him to join them. "Yes, I've decided to sell Gossington Hall after all. Too many unpleasant associations now." Carstairs settled into the vacant chair. "Besides, the constant stream of reporters and curiosity-seekers makes it impossible to work. I've taken a cottage in Cornwall, somewhere quiet and anonymous." "A wise decision, perhaps," Miss Marple acknowledged. And the legal matters? I understand you reached an agreement with the Crown Prosecution Service, Carstairs nodded. A suspended sentence in exchange for my testimony against Peters and Wilkins. My publisher is furious about the scandal, of course, but my literary agent thinks it might actually boost sales of my next book. He gave a rueful smile. Apparently, notoriety has its advantages in the publishing world. And Professor Wilkins, Miss Hardwick asked, has there been any resolution to his case? Released on bail pending further investigation, Carstairs replied. Lord Melchett has hired an impressive legal team to pursue the family's claim to the manuscript. The case could drag on for years. He placed the small parcel on the table. Before I forget, Miss Marple, I brought this for you, a small token of my appreciation. You saved me from being convicted of a murder I didn't commit after all. Miss Marple unwrapped the package to reveal a first edition of a Jane Austen novel. How very thoughtful, Mr. Carstairs. Truly delightful. After Carstairs departed promising to send his new address once he was settled, Miss Hardwick helped Miss Marple clear away the tea things. He seems genuinely repentant, Miss Hardwick observed. I believe he is, Miss Marple agreed. Weakness rather than malice led to his involvement. He allowed himself to be manipulated by a stronger personality, a common, enough human failing. The telephone rang, and Miss Marple excused herself to answer it. When she returned, her expression was thoughtful. That was Inspector Craddock, she explained. They've completed their examination of the hiding place in the library wall, behind the vault where the manuscript was. Stored, they discovered another compartment containing a small diary, apparently Sir Randolph's private journal. It confirms Peters's account, remarkably enough. Sir Randolph recorded that he had fallen accidentally during an argument with his assistant. So Peters was telling the truth about his grandfather's innocence? It appears so, though it doesn't change the fact that Gregory Peterson abandoned an injured man who might have been saved with prompt medical attention. Miss Hardwick considered this. It's strange how the past and present have mirrored each other. In both cases, the manuscript drove men to desperate acts, though not quite the acts we initially assumed. Human nature remains constant across the generations, Miss Marple observed. The same passions, the same weaknesses, the same capacity for self-deception. Later that evening, after Miss Hardwick had gone, Miss Marple sat by her window watching the sunset paint the garden in golden light. Her thoughts drifted to Sir Randolph, the scholar whose discovery had brought both triumph and tragedy into his life, and whose secrets had reached across nearly a century to claim new victims. The ancient manuscript would now take its rightful place in a museum, studied and admired by scholars from around the world. Sir Randolph would have his recognition at last, though not in the manner he had planned. The doorbell rang, and Miss Marple rose to find Mrs. Bantry on her doorstep, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables from her garden. "Jane, I've brought you some of those runner beans you admired. And I simply had to tell you the latest village news. Dr. Haydock is retiring, and you'll never guess who's buying his practice. Young Dr. Peterson from London. No relation to our American criminal, I'm assured." Mrs. Bantry sailed past into the parlor, continuing her stream of local updates. Miss Marple smiled as she followed her friend. The great dramas might come and go, mysteries might be solved, criminals apprehended, but the rhythms of village life remained steadfast and predictable. There was comfort in that continuity, in the small everyday patterns that formed the tapestry of St. Mary Mead. And if those patterns occasionally revealed darker threads, well, that too was part of the human condition that Miss Jane Marple had spent a lifetime observing, with her characteristic blend of compassion and clear-sighted perception. Chapter 11. Lingering Questions. 3 days after Carstairs' departure from St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. She was pruning her hydrangeas when Inspector Craddock appeared at her garden gate, his expression suggesting This was not merely a social call. "Inspector, what a pleasant surprise," she greeted him. "Would you care for some lemonade? It's particularly refreshing today." "Thank you, Miss Marple," he replied, following her to the garden table. "I'm afraid this isn't a purely social visit. There have been some developments in the case." Miss Marple set aside her gardening gloves. "Indeed? I had thought matters were largely resolved." "So did we." Craddock accepted the glass she offered. "But two things have come to light that cast a slightly different perspective on events." He withdrew a small notebook from his pocket. "First, the forensic examination of Sir Randolph's diary has been completed. While the content appears genuine, the experts believe the diary itself is not as old as it should be. The paper, ink, and binding all suggest it was created within the last decade, not in the 1920s. "How very curious," Miss Marple murmured. "A modern forgery of a genuine account?" "Precisely. Which raises the question, how did the forger know the details of Sir Randolph's private thoughts regarding his fall, unless the forger had access to the original diary," Miss Marple finished, "or to someone who knew its contents." Craddock nodded. "The second development concerns Gregory Peters. We've been unable to verify certain aspects of his background. Columbia University has no record of a visiting scholar by that name, and his claimed connection to Charles Millbrook appears increasingly dubious." "Most interesting," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Have you shared these findings with Miss Hardwick?" "Not yet. I wanted to consult with you first." Craddock hesitated. "There's one other matter. We've received information suggesting the manuscript itself may not be what it appears." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. "Another forgery? Possibly. The British Museum experts are divided. The materials are certainly authentic to the period, but there are inconsistencies in the illumination style that some find troubling." As they discussed these new complications, the telephone rang inside the cottage. Miss Marple excused herself to answer it, returning moments later with a puzzled expression. "That was Raymond," she explained. "Margaret Holloway has disappeared." "From London. She left the British Library yesterday afternoon and hasn't been seen since. Her flat shows no signs of disturbance, but her passport is missing." "This becomes more complex by the hour," Craddock said grimly. "I should return to the station immediately." After the inspector departed, Miss Marple remained in her garden, her knitting needles moving steadily as she considered the new information. The click of the garden gate roused her from her thoughts. Miss Hardwick stood there, her expression troubled. "Miss Marple, may I speak with you? Something rather disturbing has occurred." "Of course, my dear. You seem quite upset." Miss Hardwick sat down, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "I was organizing the historical archives this morning and decided to review that old housekeeper's diary Mrs. Bantry donated years ago, the one Peters was so interested in." "And?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "It's been altered." Miss Hardwick's voice quavered slightly. "Certain pages have been carefully removed and replaced with forgeries. The paper is similar, but not identical, and the handwriting, while very close, shows subtle differences when examined carefully." "How very significant," Miss Marple murmured. "And these altered pages, do they contain references to Sir Randolph's assistant?" "Yes. Specifically, they introduce arguments between them that weren't mentioned in the original diary. I remember the contents quite well. I transcribed the entire diary when it was first donated." Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "My dear, I think we should telephone Inspector Craddock immediately." That evening, a small gathering assembled in Miss Marple's parlor at her request. Inspector Craddock, Miss Hardwick, Raymond, and, somewhat surprisingly, Mrs. Bantry. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began. "Inspector Craddock has shared with me certain discrepancies that have emerged in the Gossington Hall case. I believe I may be able to offer some clarification." She turned to Mrs. Bantry. "Dolly, would you be so kind as to share what you told me this afternoon about the housekeeper's diary?" Mrs. Bantry straightened importantly. "Well, when I found the diary in the Gossington attic all those years ago, I naturally read it before donating it to the village archives. It was quite mundane, really. Household accounts, weather observations, occasional comments about Sir Randolph's habits. But there was absolutely nothing about arguments with his assistant or any disharmony in the household. Miss Hardwick has confirmed the diary was altered, Miss Marple continued. Someone carefully replaced certain pages to establish a false historical narrative, one that would support the story of Gregory Peters's grandfather being present during Sir Randolph's fatal accident. Craddock leaned forward. But why go to such lengths? What purpose would it serve? I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that we have been witnessing an elaborate deception, one that began long before the supposed discovery of Sir Randolph's letters. She turned to Miss Hardwick. You mentioned that Peters contacted you by telephone before the Historical Society meeting. Might I ask what you discussed? Miss Hardwick looked startled. He introduced himself as an American scholar researching Sir Randolph's work. He asked about our local archives, particularly any personal papers from Sir Randolph's time, and he specifically inquired about the housekeeper's diary. Yes, though I didn't think it significant at the time. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Establishing the existence of that diary was crucial to his plan. It provided historical context that could be manipulated to support his fictional family. Connection to Sir Randolph? But why? Raymond asked. What was the ultimate goal? The manuscript itself, of course, Miss Marple replied, not as a historical artifact to be preserved in a museum, but as a valuable item to be sold privately to collectors. The entire elaborate scenario, the forged letters, the manufactured connection to Charles Milbrook, even the apparent kidnapping, all served to establish the manuscript's authenticity and create a compelling provenance. Craddock looked skeptical. Are you suggesting Miss Hardwick was complicit in her own kidnapping? Not complicit, Miss Marple corrected gently, but perhaps the events didn't unfold precisely as we were led to believe. Miss Hardwick's face had grown increasingly pale during this exchange. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. Inspector, she said quietly, I believe Miss Marple is suggesting that I have not been entirely truthful. And she is correct. A charged silence fell over the room. Miss Marple's expression remained kind, but penetrating as she regarded the librarian. I think, she said softly, that it's time for the complete truth about the events at Gossington Hall. Don't you agree, my dear? Miss Hardwick took a deep breath. Yes, I suppose it is. The ticking of the mantel clock seemed suddenly loud in the stillness of the cottage parlor. Outside, the evening shadows lengthened across Miss Marple's garden, casting the roses into deepening shades of crimson and gold. Chapter 12. Final Revelations. I first met Gregory Peters 3 years ago at an academic conference in New York, Miss Hardwick began, her voice steady despite her evident distress. He wasn't using that name then. He was introduced to me as Gabriel Pritchard, a private collector of medieval manuscripts. She glanced apologetically at Inspector Craddock. He contacted me again last autumn, saying he had information about a manuscript of extraordinary significance that might be hidden at Gossington Hall. He had traced Sir Randolph's history and believed the Tudor journal story was a cover for something far more valuable. And you believed him? Raymond asked. His research was impeccable. He showed me letters from Sir Randolph's colleagues that suggested he had made a remarkable discovery shortly before his death. When Edmund Carstairs purchased Gossington Hall and began researching Sir Randolph's life, Peters, or Pritchard, saw an opportunity to use Carstairs as a means of accessing the house, Miss Marple suggested. Miss Hardwick nodded. The plan was for Carstairs to discover forged letters that would renew interest in Sir Randolph's work. Meanwhile, we would search for the real treasure. It was supposed to be a scholarly pursuit. Peters convinced me we were writing a historical wrong, ensuring Sir Randolph's greatest discovery wouldn't remain lost forever. But at some point, Inspector Craddock said grimly, the plan changed. Yes. Miss Hardwick's voice faltered. When Mrs. Carson overheard us discussing the manuscript, Peters panicked. He insisted we needed to silence her. I refused absolutely, and threatened to expose the entire scheme. That's when he attacked me and staged my kidnapping. "So you truly were held captive?" Mrs. Bantry asked, unable to contain her curiosity. "Yes, though not in the gamekeeper's cottage, as I claimed. He kept me in a small hotel in Barchester. When I realized he had killed Mrs. Carson, I was terrified. I managed to escape and went into hiding briefly, trying to decide what to do." "And then you returned with a carefully constructed story," Miss Marple said gently. "One that would protect your own involvement while ensuring Peters would be captured." Miss Hardwick looked down at her hands. "I've spent my life preserving historical truth. The idea that I had contributed, however unwittingly, to theft and murder." She shook her head. "I couldn't bear it. But I also couldn't bring myself to confess my initial complicity." "What about Margaret Holloway?" Raymond asked. "Was she involved as well?" "Completely innocent," Miss Hardwick assured him. "I genuinely did consult her about the letters, when I began to suspect they were forgeries. Her disappearance now is—" She hesitated. "Concerning?" "Indeed," said Inspector Craddock, "particularly in light of another development. The British Museum's final assessment confirms that, while the manuscript is genuinely ancient, it shows signs of having been altered in modern times to appear more significant than it actually is." "A genuine artifact, deceptively enhanced," Miss Marple murmured. "Rather like the story surrounding it." Miss Hardwick looked stricken. "Even the manuscript itself was part of the deception? I never imagined—" "I suspect," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that Peters, or whatever his real name might be, is what one might call a historical confidence man. He identifies genuine artifacts of moderate value, enhances them to appear more significant, then creates elaborate scenarios to establish their provenance and increase their worth. For private sale to unscrupulous collectors," Craddock concluded, "who would pay handsomely for such items, no questions asked. And Margaret Holloway's disappearance suggests she may have discovered something about the manuscript's authenticity." "That made her a liability," Raymond added. Inspector Craddock rose. "Miss Hardwick, I appreciate your honesty, belated though it may be. I'll need a formal statement, of course, but your cooperation will be noted favorably." After Craddock and Miss Hardwick departed, Raymond and Mrs. Bantry lingered, both visibly processing the evening's revelations. "I cannot believe Miss Hardwick, of all people, would be involved in such a scheme," Mrs. Bantry said, shaking her head. "She's always been so proper, so dedicated to historical accuracy." "That very dedication made her vulnerable," Miss Marple observed. "Peters appealed to her scholarly passion, her desire to uncover lost knowledge. He manipulated her strengths rather than her weaknesses." "How did you know?" Raymond asked. "What gave it away?" Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Several small inconsistencies. The timing of her reappearance was suspiciously convenient. Her knowledge of the vault's combination seemed improbable if she'd been kept drugged and disoriented. But most significantly, her note to me, not where but when, showed a clear understanding of the hiding place's mechanism, knowledge she couldn't possibly have gained during her brief escape." 2 weeks later, Miss Marple was deadheading her roses when Inspector Craddock appeared at her garden gate. "Good news, Miss Marple," he announced. "Margaret Holloway has been found, safe and well." "How wonderful," Miss Marple said with genuine relief. "Where was she?" "In Florence, of all places. When she identified certain modern alterations to the manuscript, she received a threatening telephone call. Instead of coming to us, she fled to Italy to consult with an expert who could confirm her findings." "Very sensible of her," Miss Marples approved. "And Peters, still in custody, though he's refusing to reveal his true identity. We've contacted Interpol and discovered similar schemes in France, Italy, and Austria over the past decade, always involving historical artifacts with cleverly constructed provenances." "And Miss Hardwick?" "Cooperating fully. The Crown Prosecution Service has agreed to minimal charges in exchange for her testimony." Craddock shook his head ruefully. "She's been offered a position at Cambridge, once this is all behind her. Their experts were impressed by her analysis of the forged letters. A fitting outcome," Miss Marple said. "Her expertise is genuine, even if her judgment was temporarily compromised." After Craddock departed, Miss Marple continued tending her garden, reflecting on the case's many layers of deception. From Sir Randolph's original secrecy about his discovery to Peters's elaborate confidence scheme, the story had unfolded like one of her rose bushes, each layer revealing another beneath, until the true heart was finally exposed. That evening, she wrote in her journal, noting the patterns of human behavior she had observed once again. People remained consistently themselves, even in extraordinary circumstances. Carstairs's weakness, Miss Hardwicke's scholarly passion, Peters's calculating opportunism, all had played their prescribed roles in the drama. The ancient manuscript would eventually find its proper place in a museum, its modest but genuine value appropriately acknowledged. Gossington Hall would pass to new owners, its secrets finally exhausted, and St. Mary Mead would continue its placid existence, the ripples of excitement gradually subsiding into the village's collective memory. Though, following Sunday, Miss Marple attended morning service at the parish church. As she listened to Reverend Clement's sermon on truth and redemption, she noticed Miss Hardwicke seated quietly in the back pew, her first public appearance since her confession. After the service, many villagers pointedly avoided the librarian, their disapproval evident in averted gazes and whispered comments. Miss Marple, however, approached her directly. "My dear, would you care to join me for tea this afternoon? My garden is particularly lovely just now." Miss Hardwicke looked up, surprise and gratitude in her eyes. "I would like that very much, Miss Marple. Thank you." As they walked together toward the lych gate, several curious glances followed them. Miss Marple nodded pleasantly to Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Weatherby, who stood watching with undisguised interest. "They'll be talking about this for weeks," Miss Hardwicke murmured, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "People will always talk," Miss Marple replied serenely. "But they also forget, given time, and occasionally they even forgive." The spring sunshine fell warmly upon the ancient churchyard as the two women made their way out into the lane. Behind them, the centuries-old tower stood as it had for generations, a silent witness to the endless cycle of human dramas, great and small, tragic and redemptive, that unfolded beneath its steadfast gaze. Miss Marple glanced back once at Gossington Hall, visible on the distant hillside. Its windows gleamed in the morning light, no longer hiding secrets, but simply reflecting the beauty of the day, as it would continue to do long after all those involved in the curious case of the lost letters had passed into memory.